A very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We approach the last session of the ORF Kolkata Consulate General in Kolkata hosted International Conference on Strategic High Tide in Indo-Pacific Economics, Ecology and Security. Massive deliberations have happened over the last 2 days. Various speakers deliberated on a host of issues that have helped us delineate an approach to a new Indo-Pacific concept and the critical interface of geopolitics and security as per its traditional definition, commerce and connectivity, and environmental concerns and engagements. At ORF Kolkata, we approach the Indo-Pacific challenge through the multidisciplinary lens of both security and development perspectives, and as a potboiler of the interactive dynamics of geopolitics and geostrategy. Geoeconomics assessing the various existing trade and economic architectures and the threats posed on the environmental front through the human anthropogenic interventions on an organic working of the natural ecosystem, as also the forces of global warming and climate change. Now, as we come to the end of the deliberations, it is time to sum up the challenge as a whole and not merely through their compartmentalist coupes of economics, ecology, and geopolitics and security. And this is where this valedictory session is going to contribute. And here we have a special address from Professor Harsh Pant, Director of Studies and Head of Strategic Studies at the Observer Research Foundation. And finally, the valedictory address by Dinusha Panditaratne, who is the Advisor and Head of Asia at Commonwealth Secretariat, UK. Without much ado, let me turn to my esteemed colleague, Professor Pant, for his address. Over to you, Harsh.
Thank you, Nilanjan, and let me start by thanking Dr. Ghosh, Dr. Anusriya Basule Chaudhary, everyone involved at ORF Kolkata and the Council in general for organizing this very important conversation around a theme that the salience of which cannot be underestimated, because it is now part of our vocabulary. Indo-Pacific is part of our everyday vocabulary. In fact, not a day passes wherein something or the other does not emerge out of this, out of the engagement with the Indo-Pacific. There is also this wider issue for as the two-day deliberations underscored, as the center of gravity moves to this part of the world. Its definitional impact, its impact on even those countries that do not see themselves as Indo-Pacific countries, as resident powers in the Indo-Pacific, even the impact on them is quite visible, and the way revaluations are happening across the globe. This is something that that comes out very clearly in what we've discussed so far. And I think when you think of the discourse and the deliberations over the last two days, and I would say last 2 days have summed up in some ways a lot of what a decade-old agenda of evolution in this realm, insofar as various dimensions are concerned. But fundamentally, I think what we are looking at is a structural change in the system, in the way we look at this maritime space, and how the rise and fall of certain powers conveys to us not only the sense of the rise and fall of those particular powers themselves, but also how that rise and fall defines or creates or maps out new conceptual geographies for us. And I think Indo-Pacific is a great example. Eurasia is another. But I think Indo-Pacific, given that the last decade has been about Indo-Pacific in more ways than one, I think this idea that this is a big, huge maritime space where major powers have emerged. China's rise is the most fundamental reality, without which we won't be discussing a lot of these themes. But also, I think the approach and the engagement of other powers, and I'll come to I'll come to the middle powers in the end, because I think that's where we want to situate this conversation, including India and Japan. But I think the larger reality that fundamentally structural transformation has happened, and we have to respond to it in a manner both from a policy perspective, as well as I would underline from an academic perspective, from a conceptual perspective. How do we think about How do we think about institutions? How do we think about norms? How do we think about power structures at a time when the old definitions, old binaries no longer work? The definitions of east, west, north, south, developing, developed, all of them are undergoing a dramatic transformation. So how do we, sitting in Delhi or sitting in London or sitting in Tokyo, think about some of these configurations is an important, I think, task for us, those who work in the policy world, but also those who work in the academic world, because a lot of the time academia seems to be behind the curve in many of these conversations. So are we there? Are we at a stage where we can think of bridging this divide in some ways? Because the transformation of the structure in the structural run is quite significant. Similarly, I think the second aspect here is the changing nature of security. I think Dr. Ghosh pointed it out. When you think of security in a traditional sense, we will talk of Indo-Pacific and we'll talk of, again, certain powers, how do they relate to each other, and what is the security agenda on the table. But if there is anything the last year and a half has taught us, is that the whole traditional versus non-traditional binary also needs to undergo a fundamental redefinition, because we are looking at a landscape where almost all the questions, whether health, trade, technology, ecology, environment, all of them are now part of high politics. To say that these are something that would be added on later once we have discussed the strategic mapping of the region no longer applies. If COVID-19 had done anything, it has alerted us to these realities, that these fundamental aspects of international relations, we need to think about whether we are thinking about new ways of understanding it, or whether we're thinking about new ways of managing the security dynamic in the region. And similarly, if you look at the institutional void that is being filled by by various minilaterals, plurilaterals, whatever you might want to call them, but there is an institutional void, because the Indo-Pacific geography did not exist before. In some ways, in our imagination. So the idea that you don't have institutions that can respond to the challenges today. So we are filling it up, and the nations are filling it up with ad hoc coalitions, with issue-based coalitions. This is the age of variable geometries. But those variable geometries need to come to terms with each other as well. They cannot be in isolation from each other, because at the end of the day, the idea would be that if this is a region that needs to have certain kind of a governance architecture, then are the minilaterals, are the plurilaterals sufficient in giving that institutional architecture to them? And I don't think we have answers to them yet. But I think if anything, this conversation should alert us to that possibility. Similarly, what are new norms that have been created? Because the question is that some countries are challenging old norms, but are not providing new normative structures. So what are the new norms and principles and regimes that are being put in place? I think those sets of questions have been part of the discourse, but today, as we look at a post-COVID world, or hopefully where health and wealth crisis will have to come together to shape the strategic architecture of the future, these questions are important for us to consider and to embark as those of us who work in the policy realm and those of us who work in the larger academic space. But I think, given this conversation that this is happening with with institutions in India and Japan coming together, what I think this moment in international politics also alerts us is to the possibilities that have emerged from middle powers. India, Japan, Australia, ASEAN, these are the members, these actually have led the debate on Indo-Pacific. If you just think about two major powers of our times, America is so consumed by its domestic dysfunctionalities. We thought that Mr. Trump was dysfunctional, but it turns out Mr. Biden is actually is also equally dysfunctional. So, in a sense, the domestic politics, the domestic landscape in the U.S. is such that to rely on the U.S. as the primary guarantor of either security or the developmental priorities is something that countries are no longer willing to do. And similarly, on the other hand, you have China that is not willing to step up as a responsible stakeholder. So I think within that space, you have middle powers that have come up and they have shaped the discourse. And I would go so far as saying, without Japan, the conceptualization of the Indo-Pacific would not have happened. The whole idea, the conference of the two seas, the whole paradigm shift that happened once Prime Minister Abe started articulating a certain vision of the Indian and Pacific Oceans coming together, it led to certain sets of consequences, and we are looking at those consequences today. I think the articulation was very consequential in its own way. Similarly, I think I would also go, I would also argue that if it were not for India, a lot of the operationalization of that concept would not have happened. Because India was always seen as a very important pivot around which a lot of these debates would revolve. And so once India decided that it wanted to pitch in here, I think the acceptability of Indo-Pacific, the idea that Indo-Pacific is something that other states like ASEAN, for example, or the Western countries now that you see European Union and individual Western nations, UK, Germany, France, Netherlands, all of them accepting the logic of Indo-Pacific, coming to terms with their own Indo-Pacific policies. I think without India that would not have been possible. So in a sense, you look at these middle powers and you say, well, I think it is their age, it is their era. They can define terms of engagement not simply in a strategic sense, in terms of high politics, but also in terms of what we do on trade, on what we do on geoeconomics, what we do on ecology and environment. And I think that space is available, and that there is a desire for leadership because there is a vacuum that is being fed. So I would hope that such conversations that often emerge from these from what we have done over the last 2 decades, a very productive set of conversations, can lead us to think more coherently, both conceptually and operationally, about some of the challenges that we have talked about, whether it is strategic security issues or ecological issues or economic or geoeconomic related issues, and how as policy community we can start thinking of building a coherent architecture around that. But that is all I have to say. Congratulations to everyone, and I look forward to listening to Dinusha. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Pant, for putting across the Indo-Pacific challenge so coherently, drawing the broad contours of this particular challenge. You touched upon a host of issues, including the structural change that has been happening over the last decade, the rise and decline of powers, and also, in fact, the ways the challenge emerges in the policy domain, as also, in fact, in the academic domains. So how the institutional void, the norms, and how essentially the void is going to be, whether at all we are going to see any kind of filling up of that void over time. And of course, you touched upon the health and wealth crisis and the changing nature of security. So with that, rather, given this context, I would like to turn upon Dinusha Panditaratne, who is the advisor and head of Asia at the Commonwealth Secretariat, UK. So, Ms. Panditaratne, it's over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Ghosh, Professor Pant, and Ms. Basu. It's really a pleasure to be with you and deliver this valedictory address at a very timely conference on the strategic high tide in the Indo-Pacific. I'd like to thank ORF for the kind invitation, and special thanks to Dr. Ansa Basure Chowdhury for her warm outreach. It's been a privilege to learn from old friends and new voices on the themes of this conference, which Professor Pant has also elucidated on: geopolitics and security, commerce and connectivity, and ecological concerns in the Indo-Pacific. I'm not going to attempt to comprehensively summarize the very varied insights, but I will, in these 15 minutes, try to make three related remarks, which draw on some of the more conceptual aspects of the insights to take forward what Professor Pant was discussing. And the remarks are by no means definitive, so I'll frame them more as questions on the overarching theme of the conference, which is, of course, the strategic high tide of the Indo-Pacific region. The questions are, I guess, first, how do we measure the success or impact of Indo-Pacific institutions in managing this current high tide? Second, how well equipped is the institutional architecture of the Indo-Pacific to address the wide range of issues that are contributing to the tide. And third, looking ahead, what is going to propel or at least support an enduring concept of the Indo-Pacific. And my thoughts will touch on some priorities of the Commonwealth, which, as you may know, is an association of 54 member states, 8 of which are in South and Southeast Asia, 11 in the Pacific, and a total of 32 across all regions, which are classified as small states and therefore especially vulnerable to climate change and other developmental challenges. The Commonwealth is organized according to traditional geographical regions, including Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, Americas, Europe, and the Pacific. However, some of the member states have in recent years articulated a view or strategy on the Indo-Pacific, either individually or within regional groups like ASEAN and the European Union. And we do continue to note these interests with these developments with interest and consider their potential impact on member states. At a more personal level, my remarks will also take the perspective of someone who, until very recently, lived and worked in a smaller state, an island state, in a geography that people now identify as the Indo-Pacific, and they'll take into account the potential of the concept and architecture of the Indo-Pacific to make a tangible difference in meeting the priorities of smaller states and island states, and particularly when compared to what is offered by alternative concepts and systems, including, but not limited to those led by China. So, as conferences like these are evaluative exercises, my first question is to ask, how do we evaluate? How do we measure the success or impact of the architecture of the Indo-Pacific? In other words, of the concept and the related institutions. I think some assume that we measure success or impact of any multilateral architecture in absolute terms, according to the objectives that it sets for itself, rather than in relative or comparative terms. But in yesterday's panel discussion, I think the moderator very valuably brought up the recurring question that implicitly queries this assumption. And she asked if the Indo-Pacific is a counter-narrative to the Belt and Road Initiative. In response to that question, I think speakers made very cogent arguments that it is not a counter-narrative. It is not a competitive framework to the BRI. For example, because Indo-Pacific is regional in its conception, while the BRI's reach is now more global. And certainly, the two frameworks are distinctive in origin, in focus, in reach, in their respective institutions, and these distinctive contexts will lead them to being measured and evaluated in different ways. That said, however, I think it's worth emphasizing that in a more day-to-day pragmatic sense, from the perspective of smaller states, island states, and less developed states in the region, the two frameworks of the Indo-Pacific and BRI will continue to be compared and will be measured according to at least some common criteria. And in particular, I would imagine that for many of these smaller and developing states, the Indo-Pacific and BRI frameworks are being evaluated and will be evaluated for the foreseeable future according to what they respectively offer by way of solutions to the region's pressing concerns. And considering what those pressing concerns are, the strategic high tide that speakers have discussed over the past 2 days undoubtedly encompasses challenges to peace and security to the region. States are concerned about peace and security in maritime spaces, as well as in relation to terrestrial developments, including, of course, in Afghanistan, that was raised by one speaker. However, they also very valuably discussed a host of other pressing problems beyond security and defense priorities, to which states are seeking affordable and sustainable solutions and avenues for better regional cooperation. The thematic sessions of this conference indicate that the problems are manifold. Speakers this morning highlighted regional gaps in trade and connectivity, in supply chains, critical digital infrastructure like undersea cables. One speaker also underscoring the continuing absence of a geo-economic framework in the Indo-Pacific, again raising implicit comparisons to competitive frameworks. As the previous panel discussed with tremendous detail, regional problems also relate deeply to ecology and the environment. And Professor Pant, I think, very valuably noted that those used to be seen as sort of secondary or concerns that came later, but they're now very much here and now. Speakers noted that they pose existential threats, and said that the resulting non-traditional security risks are no longer a question of what if, and they are now clearly a matter of when. They stress the need to accelerate regional cooperation on issues such as forced migration, disaster relief, and also on the day-to-day issues like IUU fishing and depleting fishing stocks, as well as maritime plastics pollution. In addition, the pressing concerns of states in the region also included challenges relating to health and education. These twin priorities, I think, have always been acute challenges for small and developing countries, but they have become critically so since the onset and persistence of the COVID-19 pandemic. An article recently published by ORF noted that the Indo-Pacific region continues to have the largest unvaccinated population in the world. And earlier this year, the Commonwealth Secretary General, the Right Honourable Patricia Scotland, and the Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, co-authored an op-ed in which they highlighted what they described as the perfect storm of huge issues confronting less affluent economies, including, of course, lack of access to COVID-19 vaccines and climate change. So these economies will continue to look urgently for assistance from a range of bilateral and multilateral sources. This brings me to the second question, which several speakers touched on, and that is whether the institutional architecture of the Indo-Pacific is geared to solving this wide range of pressing problems. This is a complex question, and it certainly does not lend itself to a yes or no answer. I think the institutions and methodologies of the Indo-Pacific are still evolving, and any concrete judgment would be premature. But if we believe that there is a storm of issues confronting states in the region, and that the Indo-Pacific framework will be at least partly evaluated on how much it helps to manage or calm the storm, it is worth asking the question and continuing to keep in mind how the Indo-Pacific's architecture can be improved or adapted to better meet the range of critical challenges. And speakers shared many insights that are relevant in answering this question of improvement or adaptation, I think several of which bode well for the potential of the Indo-Pacific architecture to meet the needs of smaller and developing states. For example, Mr. Vishwas Sapkal of the Ministry of External Affairs highlighted the 7 pillars of India's Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, each of which addresses specific challenges in the region in relation to ecology, capacity building, disaster management, and trade connectivity, to name but a few. And later, Akriti Vasudeva noted that the Indo-Pacific showed promising early functionality in meeting the urgent challenges of small and developing states, when the navies of the Quad's 4 countries responded in 2004 to the Indian Ocean tsunami by quickly and efficiently assisting the littoral states. At the same time, however, other speakers called for the multilateral architecture to be deepened and strengthened so that it can more assuredly address the key issues of the region. And more than one speaker remarked on the assortment of groups and initiatives that appear to be emerging under the Indo-Pacific umbrella, including Quads, AUKUS, Blue Dot Network, Quad Plus, possible Middle Eastern Quad. And while one speaker, I think, insightfully pointed out that this multiplicity is helpful in building what she described as the habits of multilateral cooperation, she did also call for a more coordinated institutional effort to help small states in the region. Professor Pant spoke just now about a coherent architecture, and similarly, another speaker emphasized yesterday about the need for cohesiveness around the various groups and initiatives of the Indo-Pacific, so that others can see how all these moving parts will eventually fit together. Finally, I think while many assume, I think with good reason, that the concept of the Indo-Pacific has already taken root, as evidenced in the various institutions and emerging parts, it is nevertheless worth asking and considering a third and final question, which is what factors underlie an enduring strategic concept? This is a broad and high-order question, and it's probably inadvisable to raise it at the tail end of the closing session of a conference, but I raise it here as food for thought to take forward, because although speakers appear to agree that the concept has taken root, many raise the question of the foundations of the Indo-Pacific when considering how deeply or widely rooted the Indo-Pacific can or will become. And several ideas were proposed to this end. To build an enduring concept of the Indo-Pacific, one noted that the larger project of regional integration rests not just on functionally addressing particular regional problems, although I have emphasized that today, and it doesn't rest on the transfer of dollars and cents on pure economics, but instead is based more fundamentally on people and ideas. And to that end, he appealed for the fostering of more people-to-people links, recommending that the Indo-Pacific institutions learn from other successful groupings in this respect, especially from ASEAN. And others, both within and outside this conference, have emphasized that multilateral architectures are ultimately built on shared values and on trust. And as a related matter, they underscore the need for countries in the Quad to meet their very worthy and ambitious commitments next year on COVID-19 vaccines. And last, it's worth recalling that the region of the Indo-Pacific already hosts a number of multilateral institutions, some of which, like BIMSTEC and IORA, carry substantial potential, but are less active and impactful than they could be. So an enduring institutional architecture of the Indo-Pacific would ideally intersect and network with some of the existing institutions of the region, thereby building or perhaps rebuilding a public confidence in the general utility of multilateral institutions in the region. And on that note, relating to endurance, it remains for me to thank you, ORF, fellow participants and audience, for your forbearance in listening to this address at the end of the second day's proceedings. I do apologize for not being able to capture all the insights shared over the 2 days, and I look forward to the forthcoming and more comprehensive event report. And I'm sure all would join me in commending this really excellent event for its opportunities to learn so much more about the high tide in our midst, and how all states in the region may safely and successfully see it through. So thank you.
Thank you, Dinusha. I think that was, though you felt that that's not comprehensive, to me it appeared pretty comprehensive. And that too, in fact, in a nutshell, you covered almost the entire gamut. In fact, just by listening to both Harsh and you, I mean, something else was coming to my mind, and it's not only confined to these two deliberations, but over the last 2 days, I have been wondering how, essentially, as a development economist, that's what I am, I would like to look at this Indo-Pacific construct. Rather, Professor Pant portrayed it as quite nicely as a geopolitical and a security problem. You also portrayed it in the same fashion, and how institutions are going to emerge, or lack of institutions create a challenge for this particular space. To me, it emerges more of as a development challenge, as also apart from being a security challenge. And this is more so because if we look at this entire theme and the inextricable linkages of these three forces, especially geopolitics and security, or geoeconomics, trade, and connectivity, and then, in fact, environment and climate change, I'm simply reminded of the sustainomics framework of Mohan Munasinghe, where he talks about the irreconcilable trinity of economy, society, and ecology, or suppose say equity, efficiency, and sustainability. And that is where the challenges essentially unfolding as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned. On the one hand, when we talk about several issues related to development, just as migration is a critical issue, livelihoods is a critical issue, climate change is a critical issue. I presume most of our security experts, including Professor Pant, Dr. Dinusha, Chaudhary, they look at this as non-traditional security. On the other hand, in fact, when I look at security, some of the critical security issues, I would like to look at them as non-traditional development issues. This is more so because they have a very, very critical impact on some of the development parameters. And they keep on impinging, just as climate change. Climate change is a result of unbridled human development ambitions on the one hand. Eventually, it unfolds itself in the form of an environmental crisis, and in the longer run, medium and the longer run, it's already knocking at our doors, but it has essentially affected human life and livelihoods. Similar is the case with when we talk about conflicts. Conflict in a development discourse, I would like to look at it more from the perspective of a social cost, which impedes on the entire development of a region. And essentially, both from a security perspective or from a development perspective, I'm trying to look at institutional response. And if institutions don't exist, what forms of institutions have to emerge so as the right kind of development order emerges in this particular region? So it solely depends on the lens through which we are looking at this entire Indo-Pacific construct or the Indo-Pacific challenge. So this is, of course, my own perspective and my own learning, rather, after listening to a host of deliberations over the last 2 days, and also listening to Professor Pant and you, because Professor Pant also mentioned something very interesting, the health and wealth crisis coming together with the COVID pandemic and as far as this space is concerned. So with that, I presume we are at the end of it. I had my learnings. I'm just trying to put across all the learnings in the context of my own framework. It might be right or wrong, but we cannot conclude just like that, because it's I presume that we have to go through constant doubts and debates and discussions, and eventually these doubts and debates are going to continue over time. So let us do that. I presume that it's only we are midway through it, and over time it's only going to accentuate or aggravate maybe. But we should do that. We should have these debates on and on. So with that, I'd like to thank both of you, Professor Pant and Ms. Panditaratne, for excellent deliberations, for excellent summing up, and I would like to thank all the panelists from whom I learned over the last 2 days and learned about how should I look at the Indo-Pacific construct. So now I'd like to hand over the mantle to my colleague Pratnashree Basu for the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. Good afternoon, everyone. As we close this very comprehensive 2-day conference on strategic high tide in the Indo-Pacific, on behalf of ORF, I would like to thank the Consulate General of Japan in Kolkata for their support towards organizing this conference and their continued support for our work on geopolitics and geoeconomics in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you to Mr. Vishwas V. Sapkal, Joint Secretary, Indo-Pacific and South at the Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India, and Rowan Ainsworth, Consul General of Australia in Kolkata, for joining our in-person inaugural session yesterday. I thank all our distinguished panelists for your extensive insights and for giving us so much food for thought over the past 2 days. For the virtual sessions, we must also, of course, thank you for adjusting your time according to our program timetable. Many thanks to the viewers who joined us online and engaged in the discussions. Finally, sincere thanks to the organizing team at ORF in both the Kolkata and the Delhi offices, and our production team for the constant support behind the scenes, which made the conference flow very seamlessly. Deliberations over the last couple of days have offered us fresh directions for thought and learnings, as Dr. Ghosh mentioned, and we do hope that going forward we can continue to find policy convergences on economy, ecology, and security. Thank you.